say this. Disaster. 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 There's really no other way to describe what went down over the weekend. Really kind of across all sports. I mean, it was a rough week of sports unless you're a Spartan basketball fan, and we will talk about that. But obviously, the main story today, sadly, is the complete and utter collapse to end the 2024 Detroit Lions season. First off, welcome into the show. Appreciate you guys hopping on. Obviously, this will not be one of our more optimistic shows. There's really no way that I can twist that Lions performance into a positive. And it's one of those things where you ever have so many things you want to say that you become afraid you're not going to say them, like that I'm going to go back and watch this podcast and be like, oh God, I forgot to bring this up, because there's so much to dissect. Breaking down this Lions performance is like breaking down a David Lynch movie. Rest in peace, by the way, because it's actually complex how awful they performed. People who were living under a rock, the Lions season ended at home on Saturday night against Jaden Daniels and the Washington Commanders. Final score of 45-31 in, I think the headline, the title of my post-game video was "That Couldn't Have Gone Any Worse." I think that's a very appropriate way to describe that game. A Lions season that was a magical campaign. The greatest regular season in the history of the Detroit Lions ends not with a bang, but with a big-time fizzle against a Washington Commanders team that won 4 games a year ago, that has a rookie quarterback, a first-year coach, new ownership, and they went into Ford Field and they straight up punked your ass. There are many reasons why I'm upset, and I almost don't know where to start, but here is where I'll start. Okay? Because I get people who know me, and I'm not going to make this about myself. Just hear me for a second. People who know me know that like my mainstay was the Tiger videos, and I've paid attention to the Lions. We started doing the Lions over the last several years, but the reason why I've always maintained arm's length from the Lions is the fact that in life, which is as uncertain as can be, there has been one absolute. The Detroit Lions fuck things up. And not in a good way. Not in a way that like the Legion of Boom fuck things up. Like they fumble the bag. Every single opportunity they have to turn a corner, they ram right into a wall. I have seen it consistently throughout my entire life. And when they brought in Dan Campbell, I turned up my nose. When they brought in Brad Holmes, I turned up my nose. And I said, look, maybe these guys know what they're doing. Maybe they're competent. The Lions will screw this up. It's what they do. When they went 9-8 in 2022, I went, okay, well, this is an improvement. This is definitely better. You know, good for them. That's great and everything. You know, finish above 500. But you know, we'll see what happens. We'll see what happens. I was not completely bought in. Rooting for them. I've never wanted them to lose, pending a tanking situation, but figuring that they would find a way to screw this up. And they had a wonderful season a year ago, a year that I said consistently, this is different. And they blew a 17-point lead in the second half of the NFC Championship game. And while that was a choke job of the highest order, I still maintain that team was a few pieces away. Their defense was inconsistent at points and ultimately ended up costing them. Throughout this entire season, because I don't make up opinions, guys. I am taking things that I believe to be fact, and then I spit out my opinion. All year, I told you, this is the team. This is the squad. Every opportunity, and they had some opportunities where things could have gone really sideways. They overcame adversity as well as a team can possibly overcome adversity. The offense was as fun to watch as any in the NFL over the last decade. I mean, that's how explosive and fun they were. They were a well-assembled team. Yes, they battled through a million injuries, and yet, bizarrely, it often didn't really affect them, because the last time we saw this defense, they pitched a perfect game against Minnesota. Okay, and I understand Sam Darnold isn't Jaden Daniels, right, and vice versa. But it seemed like there was a just bend, don't break element to this defense all season, whether they were healthy or injured. And this was planning out to be the magical postseason that was going to be a bookend on a magical regular season, because they were going to go to the Super Bowl for the first time in history. They were going to play in New Orleans in the Super Bowl. Aiden Hutchinson was going to come back a la Kyle Schwarber in the 2016 World Series. The Lions were going to win their first Super Bowl championship, capping off one of the most magical single seasons in the history of the NFL. And they would have gone down as one of the great teams ever. 18 wins. Very few teams can say that. I think the 85 Bears can say that. I'm trying to think if there's any other group that can boast that. Okay. That's how this was supposed to end. And based on what we saw throughout 17 games this year, I believe that's how it was going to end. And what we saw on Saturday was, I'm trying to find the proper adjectives, truly. And I just can't use any other word but joke. That is not to disparage or take away from what the Commanders did on Saturday and what they've done this season. Jaden Daniels is amazing. I mean, this is one of the greatest rookie seasons of all time, right? The culture there has completely turned around under new ownership. Dan Quinn has done a great job. This is a magical run for them. They won 4 games a year ago, and they've been a mess for the better part of 2 decades, and now they find themselves with an opportunity to go to the Super Bowl. And I don't want to take away any of the credit from them. They made plays. They executed. Every 50-50 play, every gotta-have-it play, they had it. Whether it was forcing turnovers, going for it on 4th down and converting, they played a masterful game on Saturday. But you will never, regardless of the injuries, ever convince me that the Detroit Lions are not a better team than the Washington Commanders. And if this was a 48-45 track meet in which neither team punted and neither team turned the ball over, it would have been disappointing, but I at least could have said, man, it was a classic game where you executed offensively, the injuries kind of caught up to you, and you lost to a team that had the ball last. It would be earth-shattering and heartbreaking, but I could almost explain it. The Lions did stuff on Saturday that I haven't seen them do all season. You could argue haven't seen them do in 2 seasons, and they did it in the biggest fucking game ever. The biggest game in franchise history. They pulled that shit. And despite the fact that this organization has done such a remarkable job of flipping the script in regards to the way that we feel about them as fans and the way the public feels about them, when it mattered most on Saturday, the Detroit Lions Detroit-lioned. Because they went out and straight up lost that football game by doing things we haven't seen them do all year. Dumb turnovers. The defense got completely and utterly gashed with 0 adjustments. Jaden Daniels had 242 yards passing in the first half. I mentioned this in my post-game video. They weren't even coming close to stops. I mean, they weren't letting it get to 3rd down. They weren't sustaining drives. It was screen pass, touchdown, long pass, and then a 10-yard touchdown. These were easy pitch and catch drives. Now you execute, right? Goff throws a pick 6. Right. Guy's been one of the more efficient, accurate quarterbacks in the league over the last 2 years. He turns the ball over 4 times, I believe. Right. Just stuff that, or 3 times, I'm sorry. Stuff that absolutely cannot happen, and it happened in this game. And to me, it falls primarily on the coaching staff. Because step 1 was that I came into this game having confidence, as did many people, with the fact that you had a Washington Commanders defense that ranked 30th in rush defense going up against an offensive attack with an explosive running game, a great offensive line, and you're getting David Montgomery back. Your goal should have been run until they stop it. Then you open the play action pass and you create some plays for Amon-Ra or for Laporta. Why in the world Jahmyr Gibbs, who was averaging 10 yards a touch in the first half of that football game, wasn't getting the ball every single play or every other play is beyond me. 3rd and 1, Goff goes back to pass, strip sack, could have had a chance to go up 14-3, turn the entire game around right there. You dial up some trick plays, but then you got your backs against the wall. You're down 10 in the 4th quarter. You're finding yourself in a position that you haven't seen yourself in all year, and you have Jameson Williams throw a pass. If you do that in the 2nd quarter, but Ben Johnson's gone into his bag of tricks many times this year. I could almost understand it. It was a slow developing bad play at a time in which you could not afford to get cute. And the reason you couldn't afford to get cute was because on the previous drive, when Washington had the ball at 4th and 2, you put 12 men on the field. I was at this game. Everyone saw this. The entire sideline was freaking out because you started the play with 12 guys coming out of a timeout. Brutal, and that's on coaching right there. And that is the kind of stuff that only an organization that has never made it to a Super Bowl is capable of pulling off. Okay? Like I said, the culture is different here. I understand it. Is the window closed? Absolutely not. And I want to maintain some optimism here. Okay. Because the reason I like doing this show and the reason I like doing these podcasts is that I think you get a slightly different version of what you get in the post-game videos. Because the post-game videos are very reactionary. It's in the moment. I'm sometimes very happy. I'm sometimes very angry. And what these podcasts do is it gives me the opportunity to breathe a little bit, take in the game. How do I feel now, 24 hours removed from the loss? And I'm actually angrier than I was when I was leaving Ford Field on Saturday. And don't get me wrong, I wasn't happy when I left on Saturday. Okay. Austin and I were miserable. We didn't talk to each other. I love the guy. But we didn't talk to each other for the first 30 minutes of the car ride back. I mean, just perplexed at how terrible they played. I mean, they could not have gone any worse. And I find myself more angry than disappointed right now because I kind of feel like a sucker. Like I was leading the charge. I was bought in completely. I had given up on the idea that the old Lions, I guess here we go, the same old Lions thing was ever going to return. That they'd finally got the right people here. They finally had the right culture, the right coaches, the right front office. And the fact is, I'll say to you what I said at the end of the NFC Championship game last year. As long as the Detroit Lions are without a Super Bowl, and as long as they are without a Super Bowl appearance, same old Lions will always exist. And I'm sorry, but we saw it on Saturday. Because I do not want to hear, well, maybe next year. And yes, there is next year. Maybe they go 20-0 next year. Okay. That doesn't take away from the fact that you had a golden opportunity in 24. And I do not want to hear, the injuries. Because the fact is, the injuries didn't affect him against Minnesota. They didn't affect him over the last several weeks. And it sucks to lose Amik Robertson the first play, literally the first play of the game. I'm not saying that there wasn't bad luck involved, right? I understand it. But here's the thing, and this has always been the disconnect that I've had with Lions fans at points, is that for years, decades, I would hear about people don't respect us. The league doesn't respect us. The commissioner doesn't like us. Refs call games against us. We never get calls. And I said, the reason for that is because you suck. Start winning games, start employing competent people, and you can be treated like a big boy organization. And to their credit, and this is where I'm going to praise them, they've done that, okay? This is no longer the bottom feeder Lions that we've seen for decades, right? This is a completely different unit. And when that's the case, you then don't get to move the goalposts when things don't go your way. Because the fact is, if the Chiefs went 15-2 with these injuries and lost the home playoff game, they'd view it as a failure. If the Ravens did it, they'd view it as a failure. If the Bills, who've never even won a Super Bowl, did it, they'd view it as a failure. And so looking at it through that lens, you have to view this postseason. I'm not going to say the whole season because it was the best in franchise history. You did win more games than you've ever won. But you have to view this run as a failure. You knew you had the squad this year. And you blew it. You played a piss-poor game on Saturday. And I'm heartbroken for these fans. And I'm not trying to condescend or talk down to anybody. People handle loss and they handle grief differently. Okay, and don't get me wrong. This is a grieving process, right? But I think that there's going to be a certain amount of bargaining of, well, we had the injuries and, Jaden Daniels played great and Goff played his worst game of the year. Who knows? Maybe it just wasn't our time. Now, this was their time. And it doesn't mean that it can't be their time again in the future, right? But this feels, and I made this comparison on Saturday, like the 2013 ALCS for the Tigers, where they still had a window that was open, but you got the impression that might have been their best chance. And ultimately, sadly for the Tigers, it was. Do I think the Lions are going to have more opportunities? I do. I mean, you're bringing back a lot of legitimate talent. I mean, you won 15 games this year, and that didn't happen on accident. But man, next season, I'm going to be so stubborn that there's going to be mules that are going to call me an asshole because this team could go 17-0 in the regular season next year. And I'm going to come on here and say, I need to see it in the playoffs. Because right now, when you look at the absolute collapse that was the second half against San Francisco last year, and when you look at the baffling game plan, baffling execution, and baffling performance that we saw by the Lions on Saturday against Washington, I think in terms of what he is as a playoff coach, the questions regarding Dan Campbell are a bit legitimate. Dan Campbell has done a masterful job in Detroit. But his aggressiveness and his identity as a football coach is kind of what cost him against San Francisco last year, and it's kind of what cost him against Washington on Saturday. And even beyond that, I mean, for all the praise that we had for Aaron Glenn and the game plan he had against Minnesota, I mean, I think the game plan against Washington was written in crayon, to be completely honest with you. I mean, whatever money he earned from that Minnesota performance, he lost all of it back against Washington. I mean, it was they tried to get pressure, they couldn't. Jane Daniels got out of the pocket a million times, made throws. He was accurate. They dominated the line of scrimmage. It was a nightmare, dude. It was an absolute nightmare. And I don't. I almost feel like I'm being too harsh because I just know how heartbroken so many people are. This is the equivalent of if the Tigers won 110 games and then like got swept by an 85 win team in the ALDS. Like it's just, it almost feels like everything that we loved, everything that we enjoyed is not false, but it's just, it comes with that touch of disappointment of like they rolled out the red carpet for you. And you couldn't finish. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to belabor the point. You guys saw it. I'm sure many of you guys were already depressed, and I get it. I mean, that one, those are the kind of ones that stick with you for a long time. I guess the last point that I'll make is, even if they're right back at it next year, this is, to a certain extent, the end of something. And that's just the fact that this staff that Campbell had done such a brilliant job of putting together, that had done such a remarkable job over the last several years, which they did an amazing job a year ago of keeping that staff around. They're going to have to make some changes. While the players coming back are going to be excellent, and there's still a lot of talent here, and I have a ton of faith in Brad Holmes, you're going to have to really hit some home runs with coordinator hires. Now, this is a very appealing destination, and they can get some coaches to come here that can do a really good job. Will they do a better job than Ben Johnson? Sans what he did on Saturday? We'll see. So there's going to be question marks. Yeah, and I know we'll move on here in a second. I know I'm going to get some flack my way for potentially being too negative about this, but I followed this team, and I watched this team this year, and I was blown away at every turn by what they were able to do. And the really sad thing is, and I know I'm rambling, but whatever, the season's over. It's not going to be talking about the Lions pending something crazy for a minute here, but the Lions had become the fun team, like everyone's B team, right? They were a fun story to root for. And there was a lot of bravado, a lot of chest thumping, right? Because the Lions believe themselves to be the hot, sexy ticket in town. And that all works when you're winning. A lot of that's gone away now. Because the image nationally that people are going to have for you going into this offseason is you peeing down your leg against Washington. So it's gonna have to be different next year. And that doesn't mean it can't be better because there's talent, but it will be different. All right. So disappointing. So disappointing. But moving on, let's talk a little bit of college hoops. I don't have any Tigers updates, guys. Sorry, but it's not my fault. Dodgers signed 8 more guys, right? Every other teams are awake. The Tigers are not. Let's talk some college hoops because there is a little bit of good. Mainly in terms of what Michigan State's been doing. But I want to start with Michigan, who split this week. They went 1-1. They lost a brutal game to Minnesota, where Minnesota made basically a half-court shot at the buzzer to knock you off. It was their first Big Ten win. Then Michigan survived against Northwestern at home on Sunday to avoid what would have been a disastrous week. I mean, in a week, we would have gone from talking about this team as a contender in the Big Ten to a team that's like, are they going to make the tournament? Now, thankfully, they survived. They do have to go to Mackey Arena next time in their next game to play Purdue. That's going to be a big test for them. Is Purdue the dominant force they've been over the last few years? No, because there's no Zach Edey. But at the same time, really tough place to play. Painter always does a great job. They're going to have to bring their A game for that. It's interesting because my perspective of this team is starting to change a little bit. And this is the thing with expectations, is that expectations are adjusted throughout the season, right? Based on what other teams do, based on what your teams do. So coming into the year, my perspective was to pretty much make the tournament. Have a good, serviceable, solid team. Let's have some clear indicators that this program's moving in the right direction. And to Dusty May's credit, but especially these players' credit, they checked off a lot of those boxes early on. I mean, I watched the first half of the Cleveland State game, and I'm like, okay, this team might be pretty good. Okay, so we are over halfway through the regular season at this point. And the, oh, shucks, it's just good to see them playing hard vibe, that's kind of dead now. Like, I know that this team has the players to be very, very good. And we see in spurts, sometimes even in full games, that team come to play. The problem is we will see, despite having the same players, this Jekyll and Hyde thing where they will have, I mean, let's be real, they had 45 minutes of it against Minnesota, and then they had, a long stretches of it against Northwestern where you question their competency. And it is most annoying when you feel like it is self-inflicted. Michigan will at some point run into a team that has more talent than they do. I mean, it's just inevitable. But for the time being, I feel like in Michigan's 4 losses, their wounds have been primarily self-inflicted, and their 4 losses are by a combined 8 points. The Minnesota game, it sucked to, give up that shot at the end, right? But in fairness, that one in a lot of ways almost bothered me less than the Northwestern game did, because we see that game in the Big Ten every single season. We see great teams go on the road against not so great teams, and they just don't play well, and the other team starts hitting everything. The Northwestern game, Danny Wolf didn't make a shot from the floor. The vibe was just off. I thought the crowd did a great job. Crowd was into the game, and they played better in the overtime, but you had, Donaldson went away for long stretches. You got good looks, and Namari missed shots, and like I said, Wolf played his worst game of the season. Now, Vlad Golden was spectacular. And I'm not even going to call it a turnaround, because he had like 5-6 kind of tough games, but he has gone from a so-so piece to this team to as dominant a big man as you can be in the country right now. I mean, he has played, I think what I said in one of my post games a while back is like, it feels like over Thanksgiving, somebody did something that really, really pissed off Vlad Golden, and he just hasn't recovered from it, because that guy is playing angry. Not only is he playing angry like down low in the post, but he's making shots. I think he's now 9 for 14 from 3-point range this season. So he's been a very efficient player. And like Roddy Gale, who was awful against Minnesota, he was 0 for 9, plays a pretty darn good game in the second half against Northwestern. You have the pieces in place. It's just a matter of making sure that those pieces can click at the same time in any particular game. And this is we bring this up in March all the time, right? But if you have experience and you have consistency, like, teams can put it together over, 3 separate weekends and make a run, potentially. This is as boom or bust a Michigan team as I can possibly remember. And I know it sounds crazy coming off of 2 pretty rough games, but I've seen these stretches where they're making shots and they defend well, where I say, God, dude, this team, they could compete and beat anybody. I mean, there's not a whole lot of weaknesses. And then I'll see stretches where I'm like, all right, well, they're going to get bounced by a 12 seed or an 11 seed in the first round of the tournament because they can't get out of their own way. And I don't know whether or not they're going to clean it up. In the early part of the season, I'm like, oh, that'll get cleaned up. That'll get cleaned up. But, it's 4 losses now where you've kind of shot yourself in the foot. And those losses, Minnesota especially, are not great losses. Arkansas has not looked good in conference. Oklahoma's looked terrible in conference. And Minnesota hadn't won a conference game until they beat you at home. So, I mean, that's the kind of loss that knocks you down a seed in the NCAA tournament. It really does. Doesn't mean they can't make up for it. Doesn't mean that their goals aren't still in front of them. It's 1 loss in the Big Ten. But for a team that I felt like had gotten progressively better in the first few months of the season, they took a step back this week. And that's not to say that they can't take many more steps forward. And ultimately, look, this is a tough league to win. And I say it all the time. They survived against Northwestern, right? They got to win. Chris Collins, I thought Northwestern played great. And I thought that they were prepared and well coached. And in the first 40 minutes, I felt like Michigan did not deserve to win that game. They played better in the overtime and did enough. But man, that was a nail biter from beginning to end. Michigan dug deep, and that's what you got to do. You're going to have to win some games where you don't bring it. It's the equivalent of a pitcher who might not have his fastball or might not have his best stuff, but he's able to just grind out and give you 6 good innings. That's kind of what Michigan was able to give you on Sunday. They survived, but the game against Purdue is going to be very telling. They can win. They can win every game on their schedule. I don't think there's a single team that I look at and say they are going to overwhelm Michigan, but sometimes Michigan can overwhelm Michigan. That's what scares me. All right, now I feel like I'm setting myself up for criticism here because I'm very critical of my team, but the team that I don't root for necessarily, which is Michigan State, is looking legitimately as good as I've seen them look in years. They had a 2-0 week. They survived a really close game, a good game against Penn State at home. And then in what was just a vintage, middle of the winter CBS Big Ten game on Sunday. They played an excellent game against Illinois. It was tight the whole way through. They had to bounce back at points. I mean, it came down basically to the last possession, and Michigan State pulled it off and survived with Breslin going crazy. You know, I came into this season, I think, with a pretty fair assessment of Michigan State, which is, look, it's now been 5 years since you last had a great team. It's been 6 since you last made the Final Four. So I'm going to judge this team potentially a little bit more harshly, because in the past I've always lived under the belief of, oh, it's Izzo, it's his program, they're going to figure it out, they're going to find it in March. And over the last several seasons, they haven't necessarily done that. So, I mean, I think people should definitely kind of pay attention when I say they look great. And I know they had 2 close games this weekend. I understand it. Or this week, I'm sorry. I know they had 2 close games this week, and maybe by some standards, people will say it wasn't impressive. Illinois is very good. And the fact is, even in their close wins, I'm seeing a version of Michigan State that I think is going to be very difficult to take care of in March. And it starts with the depth. I don't know if I've ever seen this before, but on whatever day it was, when they played Penn State, there was 8 minutes left in that game. Michigan State had 10 different players that had scored, and none of them were in double figures. Now, ultimately, you had Jade Nakins, who came alive and who's kind of become the closer for this team in a lot of ways, and Frankie Fiddler, who played an unbelievable game of his life against Penn State. What they have in terms of depth and what they can do with their guards, I think, is really kind of what's changed the season. I like Fears and I like Holloman a lot. Holloman played a phenomenal game on Sunday against Illinois. It's the stagnant offense that I felt like we saw over the last several years. It's almost as if Tyson Walker's greatness kind of got in the way, and that's not to take anything away from T-Walk, but you felt like over the last several years that it was like, hey, we're not getting anything going. Just give the ball to Tyson Walker. He can make something happen. There is a fluidity to this offense that Michigan State has right now that I feel like we haven't seen since Cassius, and that starts with the guard play. But I think that there is that toughness feels like it's back, and if that swagger feels like it's back. They have a good mix of experience. They have young guys like Jace Richardson. They brought in a few transfers. This is right now the class of the Big Ten is in East Lansing. This is the best team in the Big Ten right now. They deserve to be ranked where they are. I think you could argue they haven't lost since Thanksgiving, guys. I mean, they are 16-2 right now. I mean, it's time people should really be paying attention. Is not just this being a team that can win the Big Ten, but like a team that you potentially put on the one line if they win the conference. I mean, that's how highly I feel of them right now. I mean, I think that they are playing as good as I've seen them play in quite a while. They're going to have their rough stretch coming up at some point where they're going to have tougher opponents, but that rough stretch started with Illinois on Saturday, and they found a way to win a really good game against what is always a tough, well-coached Brad Underwood squad. So yeah, this is impressive, what Izzo's done. And I think it speaks to what the great coaches are able to do, which is they adapt and they adjust. Izzo has never been in a point where you feel like the program needs a complete 180 overhaul, but he's gotten to points where you feel like they've had to make an adjustment here or there. And every time you feel like maybe he's about to go backwards, they adjust. This is as good a team as he's had here in a minute. It's exciting. I want to get to Breslin. I like going to Breslin. I really do. Michigan State basketball, I mean, we had Steven Izzo on the show. I genuinely don't have any ill will outside of the amount of times they've broken my heart. I have a ton of respect for what Izzo's done. It's a bit different in football, more so just because the Mel Tucker stuff was whack. Not so much even the way it ended, but just the hype that was surrounding him, which was so undeserved. I like giving them shit in football and basketball. I got really nothing but respect for what Izzo's done. I think it's been a healthy rivalry for most of my life, and I hope that they got another run left in them. I really do. All right, no Tigers stuff. Like I said, football season around here is pretty much over. Yeah, disappointing week, but that will do it for this version of All Say This. If you like all our content, you can find all of it at castellanicontent.com. We are updating that site pretty much every day. We have a consistent flow of content right now. 3 guaranteed things a week. We got All Say This. We have Chris and Company. We're going to have an interview this week as well. And we got The First Watch, which is the film series that we started recently. Just reviewed Psycho, saw that for the first time, so check that out. And, of course, we are doing the post-game videos as well. Don't mean to brag, but the most recent Lions video, as of the time of this recording, is 205,000 views. Now, Twitter views are a little bit inflated. I understand that, but we know what we're doing. I think maybe. I don't know. Thank you guys for all the support. And I, despite my pessimism here, I really did have a lot of fun with Lions and Lions fans over the last few years. And I wanted this for them, man. And I wanted this for you guys. I want a championship in Detroit, truly. And so that's part of why I'm so angry, is that I'm hurt by what happened. But the crowd came to play. The crowd came to play. And the fans have been in their corner, not just this year, but they were through the hard times as well. So we will be back with another episode next week, and we'll be back with a Chris and Company at some point this week as well. Continue to support us. Follow on Twitter at Castellani 2014. We are still on TikTok because TikTok still exists in America. And the links to all those platforms can be found on our socials, especially on X. Watching on YouTube, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button. Listen in audio format on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, what have you. Love you guys to death. Appreciate all the support. Talk to you real soon. Peace and happiness.